When I was a junior in high school, I started to go through the motions to receive the Presidential Fitness Award. Does anybody remember that? Presidential Fitness Award. You had to do a few things. You had to uh, run a mile within a certain time, and you had to lift a certain amount of weight, and you had to do this and do that. And I had one requirement that I worked on because it did not come easily to me. It was the stretch, and you sat on the floor with your feet out in front of you, and there was a box, and the box had these markings on it, and you had to reach forward to a certain point. Now, I'll just repeat, I was able to pass all of the other pieces of the Presidential Fitness Award, but that one I worked on, and I didn't get anywhere near the marking that I needed to on that box. As much as I tried to stretch and relax and push, I was many inches away, and I didn't get the award because of that. It's what my brother-in-law calls the Broadbent hamstrings. I thought afterwards I was embarrassed, frankly, and I wondered, like, well, who comes up with these? Who comes up with these rules? Who comes up with these markers of what you have to do in order to get a reward? I was incensed, but not oppressed. I can only imagine what it is like for people with certain abilities to go through life and to be told every day that there are certain markers that consider you abled. And when you don't meet those markers, you don't get the reward of being accepted by society as fully human, as fully included, as fully abled in your own embodied way. And so I'm thinking about that on this Access Sunday. I'm thinking about the words of disability activist Stacy Milburn, who I know is near and dear to our own Pastor Lacey, and Stacy Milburn died earlier this year. She made so many important statements about the disabled community, but one of them is, she said, "My body doesn't oppress me, society does." And I'm reminded of what my own wife, who is a special ed teacher, once taught me about the difference between being disabled and being handicapped. Being handicapped only has to do with the place. In other words, a disabled person is not handicapped in a space if they can have access to the space. If you think of our own sanctuary, where is the one place in our sanctuary really that is not accessible to a person in a wheelchair? Anybody? I'm looking at a few of your faces. If you're saying or thinking the chancel, you would be correct. I mean, think of that symbolically. Symbolically, the chancel, the place where the worship leadership happens. It is literally elevated above the congregation. It is given a place of prominence and authority. That is the one place that a person in a wheelchair cannot access. Now, I know we're not intentionally saying this, but we are saying it nonetheless, that a person in a wheelchair is not welcome there. I don't mean to put a heavy layer of guilt, but I do mean to maybe light a fire to suggest that once we get back in the sanctuary, maybe it's time to make that space accessible. Access is important. It is important to look around at the diversity of bodies in our midst and to acknowledge as people of faith that all of these bodies are beautiful, endowed with the very image of God, and yet in saying that, we are being countercultural. And yet I would suggest that our own God is countercultural. How could we think otherwise if we didn't hear about this story at the burning bush You remember Moses at the burning bush, and he's out in the wilderness, and he has a herd of sheep, and he comes across this bush that is burning but not consumed, and he has this back and forth with a God, and the God decides to send him, Moses, an outcast, back to go talk to Pharaoh to let his people go free. But Moses can think of one reason why he may not be the right person for the job. Do you remember this detail? That Moses said, I am not, he says, depends on the translation, I am not eloquent of speech. I am not smooth of speech. Some interpreters have looked at this and said, Moses was a leader with a speech impediment. But for God, that did not disqualify Moses. Moses could not convince God that, you should look for somebody else. You should look for somebody else who doesn't have the disability I have. God said, no, you'll do. I can use this. And maybe, just maybe, it was in the fact that God said to Moses, I'm going to surround you with some other folks. So the things that maybe you don't do as well, they can pick up the slack, but nonetheless, you are the one that I am sending. And so now, fast forward from the burning bush, now up here to the 32nd chapter of Exodus. And Moses, who's been in this dialogue with God all along, is up on the mountain, up on Mount Sinai, and he's been gone for a good long time. And the people start to get impatient. There starts to be a long delay. I owe Professor Sharon Betcher for this insight that there are various moments when the people of God experience God to be an invalid or invalid God. That is, a God who is not showing up for the people in the way the people think God should be showing up. A God who should be there present in a certain way, but isn't. They are getting impatient. It has been too long. And there they are, a lot like we are these days, in a wilderness, when we're wondering, when will this God return? When will our lives return to the way we had known? We are here in this place of what feels like chaos and uncertainty, like we're living like we're upside down. We're trying to find the way forward and we can't. There are questions that we're not receiving answers to, and we are growing impatient. We want to know. And it is in that place of impatience where there's a certain vulnerability on our part. And the vulnerability is we want to rush and we want to grab for what is most certain. I came across a book by a Japanese theologian, Kosuke Koyama, called The 3 Mile Per Hour God. In that book, Koyama says, God is a slow God. God is a God that moves at about 3 miles per hour, which is about a walking pace or a light roll in a wheelchair. That's about the pace that God moves at. And so when we are frantic and moving and rushing forward and grasping and running out to find, we are way out ahead of God, who moves slowly. I think that is the challenge of this moment in the Israelite sojourn in the wilderness, that God is moving a lot more slowly than they want to be. The 3 mile per hour God is available, but we have to slow down enough to catch God. And so the people in their anxiousness, in their worry, in their disorientation there in the wilderness, they do what frankly we all do. It seems to be part of what it means to be human. We start to create little gods to stand in for the big God. And so here in Exodus 32, we have the story of what's called the golden calf. Now, one thing I want to point out is that if you study the text closely enough, which I had a chance to do, you realize that there's actually about 12 chapters of a certain material that goes from chapter 20 up until chapter 32 that was inserted into a larger narrative. In the larger narrative, there in chapter 19, Moses goes up on the mountain. He is a mediator between God and the people. And he relates that God says, people Israel, I am ready to enter a covenant with you. And if you enter this covenant with me, and if you follow my ways, then you will be prosperous. There will be well-being. You will have enough always and forever. And the people, of course, say, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal. Yeah, we'll enter that covenant with you. And then insert 12 chapters of a bunch of material about the tabernacle and the lampstands and the specific commandments and so forth. And then you get here to chapter 32. And now Moses has been gone too long up the mountain. And the people in their impatience decide to substitute for the free God a little God made of gold. I noticed this week that it's specifically earrings. And it says the young women, the young men, and the older women, they all have earrings. So they take their earrings off. And Aaron, who is Moses' brother, who acts as the priest, he melts all the gold down. And I think there's a comment here about religion. That somehow religion is what happens when we grow impatient waiting for the true God, and we start to quickly try to shore up our own comfort by creating little gods out of gold or whatever other thing we find to be most precious. And now Aaron pours all of the molten gold into a mold, and it is the mold of what is described as a calf. But if you look at the Hebrew a little bit more closely, I found that several commentators say not so much a calf as like a kind of a baby cow, but rather a male calf who is just about ready to be a bull. In other words, the mold that Aaron has made is of a bull, a young bull who is at the height of its virility. That is the mold that Aaron has substituted in the wilderness for the true and free God. Now, I want to make it plain for you again, okay? So here's the situation. They're in the wilderness. They're at the foot of the mountain. Moses, with the stutter, is up with God, and the people are realizing this God for us is invalid. This God is an invalid God. This God is not showing up for us in the way that we think that God should show up. So now we are going to create a mold, a preformed mold, an idea of what we think God should be. We're going to pour everything we find most precious into that mold, and the mold is of a virile bull, the image of masculine prowess and virility and strength and perfection. And God is having none of it. Because this is the free God. The God who was free to choose any people and chose these enslaved Hebrews. God who could have left them there to cry out in anguish, but instead made a way out of no way. Delivered them from Pharaoh and Egypt into freedom through the wilderness. a God who doesn't show up in the way we want God to show up, a God who isn't about virility, but is about freedom and creativity and liberation and a diversity of bodies, not a single mold. We've made an idol out of our own ableism in our culture. We've set up a certain mold of what it looks like to be fully human and right and beautiful, and we have excluded or felt sorry for or marginalized or silenced everyone who doesn't fit in to that mold. And we can look to the text and say that when we do that, just like when the Israelites do that, God's anger burns hot. And I know that some of you, like me, kind of bristle at wrath of God kind of language. But sometimes there is nothing so appropriate as some wrath of God, especially when the most vulnerable are being left out and oppressed. But isn't this an incredible depiction of God, that God who burns hot against this creation of an idol, something to stand in place of God, is then in dialogue with Moses? Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, points out that in this text, we experience God as a dialogic God. A God who is in dialogue with humanity, in this case, with Moses, but one who is not dispassionate, but is actually passionate about issues of justice and inclusion and diversity. A slow God who is actually capable of being angry when the people rush on ahead and want to take everything all into their own hands. But this God who is a dialogic God can be talked out of God's anger, reminded of God's covenant, called back to God's compassion, reminded who God is. I love it. Moses used this little kind of Jedi mind trick on God a little bit. It's a little bit guilt-producing. Moses basically says to God, so you want to basically give up on your people now. You want to destroy them and start over. What do you think the Egyptians would say about that when they heard that that's what you did? What do you think they're going to say about you? I know it's a strange concept of God, but this God is not a God in the mold that we want to place God. In fact, I would claim that God is not only a dialogic God, but a trialogic God, by which I am meaning to invoke the Trinity, the relationality of the Trinity, and that the dialogue of God is not always just between God and one person, but there is always another, and there is creativity, and there is always an alternate voice that is joining the table in this conversation. Can we get to the point where we do not view one mold of ability, but that we can receive and accept and rejoice each person in their own unique embodiment? Perhaps disabilities can even be strengths. The artist whose collage is on the front of our bulletin today, his last name is Manier, and he is a young man with autism. And he describes himself, first of all, as an eco-artist, because what he does is he takes posters, usually movie posters, and he rips them into 1,000 little pieces. And then he glues them and puts them together in collages like the one on our bulletin to create something entirely new and entirely different. And Grant Manier says, my disability allows me to do the art that I do, because he is able to spend that amount of time and attention on the details of his collage. He says, I have an obsession with paper. And he uses that obsession to create beautiful things for the world, outside the mold of what the world had imagined. This slow God is only moving at 3 miles per hour. And perhaps in our anxiousness and impatience, we have gotten too far ahead. Maybe we can find a way, church, to slow down and find a new place where even the invalid or invalid God has a strength that we had not yet perceived and can help us each see in our own abilities and disabilities strengths we did not know we had. Amen.